Hello, everyone. I'm Robin Koval, President and CEO of Truth Initiative, the national public health organization dedicated to achieving a culture where all young people reject smoking, vaping, and nicotine. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's Truth Initiative Impact Series, Undermining Scientific Integrity, the tobacco industry's renewed attack on research and reality. Undermining the integrity of science has been a strategy of the tobacco industry for decades, along with deflecting blame for the tobacco epidemic, protecting its markets, obstructing policy, and confusing the public about the harms of its products. Today, we see a tobacco industry that is boldly resurgent, intent on rehabilitating its image in response to the existential threat posed by the long term decline of its deadly core product, combustible cigarettes, a product that is still marketed aggressively with trillions sold each year around the world. To obfuscate this continued travesty, the industry is overtly co opting the language and look of public health organizations and enlisting others to help sell that story. We often see industry spokespersons talking about harm reduction, using the language of science and public health to create confusion and make claims about the health impact of e-cigarettes, heated tobacco, and nicotine products, which are not supported by peer-reviewed research, and presenting opinion and commercially influenced perspective as fact. As part of a larger strategy, Big Tobacco has launched a massive PR and advertising campaign to manipulate the public into believing that it has turned over a new leaf. These advertorials, specifically designed to look like editorial content, draw credibility and bolster influence from the respected news outlets they appear in, like the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Boston Globe, the very same publications that for over 20 years had honored a commitment not to accept tobacco industry advertising. According to Truth Initiative peer-reviewed research, Philip Morris International and Altria spent nearly $12 million over the past 2 years on ads like these. At the same time, the industry is attempting to infiltrate and influence scientific discussion around the potential of non-combustible tobacco products, harm reduction research, and regulatory policy to portray itself as part of the solution to end smoking, a conversation it is irreconcilably conflicted in as long as they continue to be the main source of the problem. The tactics are familiar ones to those of us who know the industry well. Launching an industry-funded research group, sponsoring entire issues of prestigious research journals, and attending and presenting at scientific conferences. In response, Truth Initiative founded the Tobacco Science Integrity Steering Committee in 2021. Comprised of researchers, policymakers, and thought leaders, the group aims to collaboratively protect and increase scientific integrity in research on commercial tobacco and nicotine products. And that is the focus of today's discussion: undermining scientific integrity, the tobacco industry's renewed attack on research and reality. It's my pleasure to introduce Ben Stockton, our moderator for today's discussion. Ben is an investigative reporter and U.S. correspondent at the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. Ben's work has appeared in newspapers like the LA Times, where he uncovered how Big Tobacco is twisting social justice messages to stoke fear in Black communities about cigarette regulations. He also recently broke the story about how R.J. Reynolds, the maker of Newport menthol cigarettes, offered hundreds of thousands of dollars to a prominent Detroit pastor to campaign against a proposed ban on the sale of menthol cigarettes. Ben, thank you so much for being here today, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Robin. We have a great panel ahead of us, collectively decades of experience on the issue of scientific integrity and the tobacco industry. So we have Dr. Barbara Shillow. She is Senior Vice President at Truth Initiative, who is hosting this panel today. And she has over 20 years of experience in conducting applied research, managing research and public health programs, and leading organizational management At Truth Initiative, she provides leadership for research that examines the impact of tobacco-related policies on youth and young adults. We also have Robert Jackler, who is professor at the Stanford University School of Medicine and is a practicing surgeon. He is the founder and principal investigator of an interdisciplinary research group called Stanford Research into the Impact of Tobacco Advertising, or SRITA, which conducts research into the promotional activities of the tobacco industry. SRITA collected more than 50,000 original tobacco advertisements, which were donated to the National Museum of American History of the Smithsonian Institution. Sean Otto is also joining us. He is the author of the award-winning non-fiction book, The War on Science, which I have a copy of right here. This book predicted the rise of anti-science authoritarians and the threat they pose to democracy. He speaks to audiences worldwide about the scientific foundations of democracy and the causes and dangers of anti-science authoritarianism, and has advised candidate science debates efforts in many countries. And we have Dr. Pebbles Fagan, director at the Center for the Study of Tobacco at Fay W. Boozman College of Public Health in Arkansas. She serves as the Deputy Director of Research on the Administrative Core of a Health Disparities Center grant and Principal Investigator of the Center's FRESH project, which aims to reduce cancer risks by helping African American women smokers in rural Delta counties implement smoke-free policies in the home. So as a jumping off point, I wanted to go to Barbara first. And I wondered if you could just set the stage a little bit for us and explain in what ways we've seen the tobacco industry shaping scientific debate and really the kind of resurgence of the industry in light of the advent of e-cigarettes.
Absolutely, Ben. We know that corporate deception in public health is nothing new, and the tobacco industry has certainly been one of the worst offenders. And we see them today really renewing their efforts to be part of and to shape the scientific debate. Some examples we saw in 2021 when Juul purchased and paid for an entire supplement of the American Journal of Health Behavior to showcase their industry-funded e-cigarette research. We also see this in the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World. This is an organization established and funded entirely by Philip Morris International. Its main mission is to end smoking in this generation, but we know that its primary activities are to promote their own research, touting the benefits of e-cigarettes and other alternative to combustible cigarettes. But it goes beyond that. Certainly in the past years, the industry has gained traction and gained ground in publishing in respected journals. But they've also openly attacked the World Health Organization. They've criticized scientists who won't support their tobacco industry research. They've hosted conferences to depict credible science as misleading and really work to position themselves as the champions of stopping the spread of misinformation while depicting credible public health science as misleading.
And Pebbles, you're someone who is doing research day in, day out. Can you tell me a little bit how you see the industry influencing your fields and what things people should be wary of?
Industry has a long history of interference with the science, and they've done it at multiple levels. So when we think about the social ecological model and how we use that model in order to understand how we change behaviors, industry has done just that in order to interfere with the science. So when you think about it, they have actually targeted the societal level and the policy level by refuting credible science by blocking and suppressing public health policies. They have also sought to co-opt our researchers and credible leaders in the community, for example, by putting the former Surgeon General on the board of one of the e-cigarette companies to change social norms, to change societal values that are in favor of them being able to get to the bottom line, which is to sell their product. They've also targeted the community level as well through infiltrating our organizations, our professional organizations, our community organizations, and again, trying to shape the scientific agenda. They have targeted the interpersonal level by targeting credible community leaders to refute our science, particularly in the area of the strong evidence base that exists around the harms of menthol and trying to recruit credible ministers and other people in the community to refute what we know is strong evidence base around the harms of menthol. So we have to remind ourselves that they have taken a multi-level approach to selling their product and interfering with the science. And once we begin to recognize that, we can begin to also take a multi-level approach to how we make sure that their interference does not actually trump what we know is good for public health.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that this is being done under the guise that now the fact that tobacco companies are making e-cigarettes and that they say that e-cigarettes can help people quit smoking, that the tobacco industry now presents itself as a force for good and not simply just selling a product that causes all these deaths around the world?
Yeah, I think that's a fabulous point. And I think this gets into our discussion around what is harm reduction. Now, we know that there's no one definition of harm reduction, but I think we have allowed industry to define it for us. Harm reduction is an approach, not a product. And we have reduced it to the definition of it being products, including products that are approved by the FDA. And if you reduce the scope of harm reduction to products, it then just becomes about profits. So harm reduction includes policies, it includes programs, it includes practices that minimize the negative effects of an addictive product, irrespective of the form that it comes in. This includes passing policies to eliminate flavored tobacco products that reduce the likelihood of initiation and continued use. That's harm reduction. It includes passing policies that reduce secondhand smoke exposure, that reduces the likelihood of non-smokers being at risk for cancer and cardiovascular diseases. Harm reduction includes tobacco cessation for all products, not just cigarettes. It includes policies to support cessation. It includes structural interventions to reduce exposure to advertising and promotion. It includes changing people's social and economic circumstances so that they won't want to reach for a product that helps them to self-medicate. For some reason, we have accepted the industry's definition of harm reduction and reduced it into products versus programs and policies that actually reduce the overall harm of tobacco to all population groups across the world.
Just to add to what Pebbles said in your question about e-cigarettes, currently the industry is certainly exploiting the scientific debate around e-cigarettes in tobacco control. Philip Morris's Project Sunrise, for example, was a long-term plan to move the company towards more social acceptability. And part of their strategy back in 1995 was to exploit existing differences of opinion within tobacco control. So today it's e-cigarettes, but they have a long track record of inserting themselves in the scientific debate.
Ben, could I make a brief comment? So I see this all in the context of the way the major tobacco companies are responding to the decline in sales of traditional combustible products like cigarettes. And what they're trying to do is to sustain addiction in their existing customer base. And they're also trying to recruit new young users to become addicted to nicotine and therefore their customers for many decades in the future. So they're diversifying. Initially, they saw hundreds of startup e-cigarette companies. So they decided to try to kill it. They couldn't kill it, so they want to own it. Vuse is now the #1 e-cigarette brand in America. They're also doing heated tobacco, most notably IQOS. They're doing recreational oral products, a variety of different snus and lozenges and gums. They're also coming out with innovative flavor delivery systems like crushable menthol. Now, to justify all of these new products, they dress it in a cloak of harm reduction. They claim that these are cessation products for adults, when in fact, the science done independent of the companies is at a great dichotomy. the industry finds that these are wonderfully effective in cessation. But in fact, those done by academics and by government independent from the industry shows that they tend to perpetuate addiction through dual use. Adult smokers use their cigarettes when they can, and in other times, they switch over to using one of these new products like an e-cigarette or heated tobacco in places where cigarettes aren't allowed. We know that discontinuities of nicotine addiction, such as waiting in an airport and taking a plane, help people to imagine a life without nicotine and actually help people to adjust in that way. And the last comment I wanted to make is what we talked about as a debate. What the industry does is it manufactures doubt. It creates, quote, debate and controversy when there's overwhelming scientific evidence independent from the industry that convincingly shows something that is adverse to the industry's business interests, so that they work very, very hard to find pliant scientists and even research institutes whose sole reason for existing is to produce science with preordained results as specified by the sponsoring tobacco company. And unfortunately, there are a number of such institutes that are only too willing to find results which support the business interests of tobacco, but not critically and independently the science.
And you touched on it a little bit there, Robert, and it brings me on to my next question about how the industry science is translated into advertising and therefore what consumers might understand about these products. And I know your research has gone into a great level of detail on these issues. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about what your work has shown.
Sure. So advertising of science commissioned by the tobacco industry goes back to the beginning of cigarettes virtually. You know, breathing smoke deeply into your lungs is not a very natural thing. Really, in the early part of the 20th century, smokers were beginning to talk about cigarettes as coffin nails and that they knew that they were unhealthful. So the industry, to reassure the worried public about the health consequences of smoking, thought up slogans like, not a cough in a carload, not one single case of throat irritation. And they commissioned research, at that time largely in universities, even in major cancer centers, that supported the marketing slogan. So in other words, they would recruit scientists willing to fabricate research with preordained results that the company could then use its advertising. They even showed images of doctors and scientists in their advertising. For example, the infamous "More doctors smoke Camels" and "More scientists smoke Kents" to reassure the public. That then transitioned into the so-called tar wars. During the tar wars, the basic logic is this: all those other cigarettes are harmful and dangerous to you, but our cigarettes are more healthful. And of course, they cooked the books on this by creating vent holes that the lips blocked when they were tested. When they could no longer put down tar levels, they just changed their strategy. That's how you got light cigarettes, super light cigarettes, and ultra light cigarettes, which basically the customer thinks means that they're super safe and ultra safe. And when they couldn't use ultra light, they just used the word ultra, same meaning in that way. Now, lest you think that they're not doing these kinds of health reassurances based in their supposed science, today the packs are different colors from light to dark, connoting light and more concentrated. The tobacco industry always leverages what's popular in culture. And right now, healthful foods are very important to many of us. When you use terms, as the tobacco industry does, notably American Spirit, natural, organic, additive free, even as far as what Winston says, from farm to pack, these products are equally deadly and equally injurious, despite the fact they use those. So the FDA has a problem. You know, e-cigarettes, for example, cannot say, use this e-cigarette to quit smoking. In fact, when Juul said, I quit, they did a cease and desist order. But smart advertisers can claim it by saying things like, it works, or a smart choice. And the consumer knows that means use this e-cigarette to quit smoking. So one general principle in tobacco advertising is any constraint put on the industry by regulators, they have the smartest people that money can buy. They have the best copywriters, they have the best illustrators, and they can easily send the same message to consumers despite limitations placed on them by the American government.
And then, Sean, some of the things that Barbara Pebbles and Robert have discussed in over the last few minutes, these are not things that are just unique to the tobacco industry, and we see this type of behavior going on in other industries. I think of greenwashing, for example, in the fossil fuels industry. And your book kind of goes into detail about the assault on science by commercial interests. And I wondered if you could talk us through a little bit how we see this issue playing out in other fields, and maybe what folks working in tobacco control can learn from other industries about how to counter some of these efforts.
This kind of marketing approach, twisting particularly health science in this case, is a common approach across all these types of commodity, usually they're commodity industries. This amalgam of law, PR, and science is put together because people essentially trust the idea of science, they trust the idea of evidence. And in our legal and regulatory system, dating back to English common law, it's all based on the idea that evidence is true. So how do you work around that? Well, these industry product defense companies then seek to confuse people about what's true and to cast doubt on what the real evidence really is. And in order to do that, they hire scientists scientists for sale. They do fake science. They publish fake scientific journals. They publish opinion pieces called review articles, which aren't actually research, in mainstream scientific journals sometimes. They attack the character and the motives of actual academic and research scientists, non-industry scientists. They love the idea of turning it into a debate and the idea that science is about debate, because they try to then take that and perpetuate that. But not all science is about debate. Science is about debate when the evidence isn't clear. But then once we have a preponderance of evidence that all points in the same direction, it becomes less and less about debate. So the idea of debate there gets turned against science and scientists to confuse people.
And just picking up a little bit on something you said there, Sean, and throwing this question over to Pebbles, one thing that really sprung to mind to me was the debate going on around menthol cigarettes. And I know in my reporting that this is a hugely controversial issue and something that the tobacco industry has been actively trying to influence. And I wondered if you could talk me through a little bit how you've seen the industry trying to influence the debate around whether menthol cigarettes should be banned, and where that may have kind of deviated from the kind of quote unquote accepted science on this issue.
I'm fascinated by the fact that it has become a debate because it has been highly politicized since the passing of the Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act. Now, going back historically, the first meetings that reviewed the scientific evidence on menthol back in 2002, then 2009, all before the Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act, came to the same conclusion about the harms of menthol that the Tobacco Product Scientific Advisory Committee, as well as FDA, concluded with regard to its addictive nature, its harms related to initiation and impeding tobacco cessation. So, of course, we went through the process of synthesizing the data again and again and again to come up with the same conclusions. Yet it has been highly divisive because, again, this is about commercial tobacco and profits. And we know that when the Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act was passed, that menthol made up about 27% of the market, whereas other flavored tobacco at that time only made up 1%. Yet, still, menthol was excluded when there was an evidence base around that. not so much around other flavors. We certainly knew that flavors caused initiation, but in terms of a scientific evidence base that had evolved over time, it was just beginning. So we have to look at menthol from a political angle and not just an angle of, how do we come up with more science to prove and reprove what we already know about the harms of this particular product. And here we are today, 20 years later from the first meeting that reviewed the scientific evidence on the harms of menthol. We're still debating this. In addition, we have to realize that we have worked in a realm where we produce strong science to inform policy, and industry is very knowledgeable about the fact that, so what? We're still going to suppress what we know is strong evidence, and the weapons that they have used are lawsuits. The weapons that they have used are interference with the journals. The weapons that they have used are co-opting credible people in our communities, our civil rights communities, such as Al Sharpton, and using him as a weapon against what we know is harmful to many communities, youth, women, LGBTQI, African American, Native Hawaiians, poor people who come from low resource communities, and the list goes on. And so we have to be very careful about how we reframe tackling issues around what is good for public health.
Mm-hmm. And Barbara, Robert and Pebbles have spoken about some of the ways that this fight is playing out, both in politics and in the media. But can you take us right back to the kind of core of the science, to the scientific journals, where we're seeing the tobacco industry infiltrating at that very basic level, and talk us through some of the kind of most egregious examples that you've seen of late of the tobacco industry influencing in the journal side of things?
Absolutely. And unfortunately, we continue to see examples of scientific journals publishing tobacco industry funded research. The Foundation for a Smoke-Free World that we talked about earlier has been successful in publishing in respected journals. And often the conflict of interest policies that might be in play for those journals are evaded or the lines are blurred. We even saw the American Journal of Public Health invite Derek Yak to do a special commentary on a special e-cigarette section of that journal. That is the Journal of the American Public Health Association, our flagship public health association here in the United States. Derek Yak, of course, at the time was the president of the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World. So, whether or not the industry is paying for these publications or simply being allowed through because the conflict of interest policies aren't enforced or aren't strong enough, there are significant consequences. And I think all of my panelists have pointed to some of these. Sean, in particular, it lends legitimacy and gives industry-sponsored research a false equivalency. The suggestion that somehow their science and our science are equivalent in just a different perspective and a difference of opinion, which couldn't be farther from the truth. It's not just about the journals, it's also about the conferences. Those are scientific spaces where for a long time, and continuing for many organizations, the industry's been able to participate. The Society for Research on Nicotine and Tobacco finally passed some policies that prohibit industry employees from directly participating in their annual conference, which was encouraging to see. They were there in large numbers before then. I think all of us that have been to those conferences can attest to. The problem there in those kinds of settings is that we're just really providing an opportunity to sit down and listen to our critical insights and to listen to our evidence, which the industry can then use and turn around and can use to counter our evidence-based policy strategies and initiatives. In some respects, we've made it incredibly easy for them, and are committed to leading efforts to really counter that moving forward.
And presumably some of the journals that you mentioned would have once kind of not dreamed of taking kind of tobacco money, Do you see that shifting within the scientific community about the acceptance over maybe accepting funds from not necessarily directly from the tobacco industry, but maybe through a front group like the foundation? How do you see that playing out in terms of the way journals are being run and the funds that they're willing to accept these days compared to maybe 10 or so years ago?
Mhm. Well, the journal landscape has, changed greatly and continues to change. There's a lot of new journals. There's more sort of what we call pay to publish kinds of journals. And so there are more outlets for potential publication by the tobacco industry. So the landscape is shifting. And I know Robert and maybe Pebbles can speak more directly to this.
Yes. So let me begin on that. Having served as editor-in-chief for more than a decade of a major medical journal, I'm very well aware of how there's been a revolution in publishing, and it is not a good revolution that's occurring. There are a whole bunch of for-profit minor journals that have come up by entrepreneurial startups that have very low standards of quality of publication and really corrupt the peer review mechanism, because the difference is most journals were supported by universities and institutions paying subscriptions. Now it's about author payment. And so the industry has vast resources, and they can literally buy whole issues by pliant journals that are very willing to take their money and publish whatever they say uncritically, and they dress up as though it was peer-reviewed when it was not generally reviewed by independent experts. So I do think it's problematic because it gives a sense of trust and an imprimatur of scientific validity when it does not represent true science. What it represents is the corporate scientific narrative. And that corporate scientific narrative is a mythology because, in fact, there is but one truth in science, and that is what the evidence and the data shows. And it is all about spin doctoring to create these papers are very often have Byzantine statistics that even I, as a long-serving scientist physician, have difficulty discerning, and it's just smoke and mirrors. It's creating a debate where none exists. It's manufacturing doubt. And then they trumpet these in public relations. They use it in lobbying, handing out, these sweeping conclusions that their products are safe, that their products don't lure children, that their products are reduced harm and therefore should be allowed on the market for reasons. But these are created science that do not withstand comparison with science done independent of sponsorship by the tobacco industry.
We're at a critical juncture right now where we have an opportunity to teach the upcoming leaders about what's happening so that when we turn the torches over to them, they will engage in ethical behaviors and promote social norms around solid and strong scientific values that make sure that credible information is out there. The other way in which things are being persuaded is through our grant system. So it's the publications, and it's through our grant system. And how that is being done is that if our researchers are being co-opted by industry, and they are the same people who are reviewing grants and scoring them in a certain way because they have a certain value and a belief system that may not be the same as others in the field, we've changed the entire landscape of the kind of research that's out there.
If I could comment, is that money is the oil that runs the academic machine. And the key thing here is disclosure and transparency, and developing in every young scientist an awareness that if something is sponsored by the industry, in medicine, the pharmaceutical industry, for example, one needs to look at it with an increased criticality based upon where the sponsorship comes and where there are employees of a for-profit company involved. Let me share one vignette, and that is the Boston Globe. So the Boston Globe, like many prestigious newspapers, have created content creation, so-called sponsored content. And they were hired by Philip Morris International to engage a number of scientists, particularly young scientists, who work on issues such as disinformation and fake news. The notion of this that was so Philip Morris could put out there that the criticism of Philip Morris was in fact disinformation and fake news, whereas their science was had veracity to it, which it usually does not. And so what ends up happening is the Boston Globe, on behalf of the sponsor, asks a series of scientists and psychologists and sociologists at prestigious institutions who are delighted to be interviewed about their research. They have passion for their research, and they're very interested in issues such as disinformation and misinformation, and they therefore become interviewed. And the interview shows up in the Boston Globe as a Philip Morris thing with a link on it to the Philip Morris website that markets Marlboro, right? And many of these young scientists were not aware that this was sponsored by a tobacco company. Even though they may have signed something, these young folks didn't understand that the money came from Philip Morris and what that meant. So I completely agree with Pebbles. I think we need to always, as we teach people as young scientists, to be critical, to think carefully about the veracity of what they're looking at, as they would any scientific area in which they have expertise, but also to very seriously consider with their disclosures. Unfortunately, the tobacco industry and its affiliates sometimes don't disclose the fact, and they hide the funding behind a separate front group so that it sort of washes it of the tobacco industry sponsorship. But nevertheless, as they control the money, you know, if the industry sponsors research, you might say, well, we give money, but in no way do we, you know, control the research. So what ends up happening is the tobacco companies grants people select, for example, a study on the alternative non-smoking causes of lung cancer. Well, yeah, so they can select what groups get funding, and it's funding that they can then use in public relations to absolve their products of the kinds of harms that they in fact cause.
I'll chime in too on the younger generation, just to build on what Pebbles and Dr. Jackler have shared. Younger researchers may just be less aware of the history of the industry. Those of us here today have been around a while, and we had the opportunity to see the industry greatly exposed in the tobacco trials of the 90s. The younger generation of researchers, not so much. So it is really important that we all work to help them understand the consequences of industry participation in scientific spaces. I really couldn't agree more with the points made.
And lots of consumers today are kind of growing up with vaping being prevalent and cigarettes being less prevalent. And some of the things that Robert mentioned struck me as quite similar to discussions that have gone on around cigarettes. The fact that, you know, there was a time when the industry was saying, you know, our products, we don't target kids. They're not addictive. And how much do you see the debate around e-cigarettes just being a repeat of the old debates that happened around cigarettes? And in what way is this the tobacco industry behaving in a way that it's always behaved versus new methods that feel innovative tactics that the tobacco industry is really calling on?
Well, I can start us off by talking about how the industry has been consistent. The bottom line is the industry is driven by money, not public health. I think Pebbles used the word profit before and identified that. So the bottom line is there's this fundamental and irreconcilable conflict between the tobacco industry's interests and public health. I mean, what has been true and remains true today is that the industry is responsible to its shareholders to increase its profits, and they can only do that by addicting new consumers and keeping them addicted to sell more products. That's the opposite of what public health wants to do, and is why we're here today talking about the importance of transparency. So, you know, the industry in many ways continues to spin the same playbook, but what has changed is that they've recognized that they have to attract new consumers with new products. You know, they're speaking to youth and young adults who've largely rejected combustible cigarettes. And so that is certainly part of their playbook moving forward.
If I could comment from the advertising lens. So the E-cigarettes, and when I say that, I mean e-cigarettes, heated tobacco, recreational oral tobacco, all the different innovations are using all of the same tropes. You'll be successful in attracting the opposite sex. You will look cool. You will look fashionable. If you use these products, there's only one message category that is different. And that is, you'll never see a cigarette brand saying, use this to quit cigarettes. But other than that, it's completely overlapping. But there is one fundamental massive difference. So in 1970, the US government banned all tobacco advertising from radio and television. Why? Because it was mass media. Well, mass media has changed. Mass media, of course, for young people is social media. Our social media analytics of the tobacco industry social media marketing shows it's through the roof. They use influencers, people with large followings on social media, often millions and certainly hundreds of thousands of followers, and then they post their own posting, or they hire an influencer, often without disclosure, to say favorable things about their product. So there is a transformation in the channels. And that's what's so dangerous about the public relations, because many prestigious media sources, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, they have for years chosen not to accept any tobacco advertising because it was contrary to the interest of the public and it was deceptive. But the industry is using these advertorials as a backdoor to product advertising in these prestigious publications. And that's a huge problem. It opens up a way of promoting their products specifically, particularly their emerging products, to a large audience. But importantly, when you have your advertorial done in similar font and similar texture to an editorial, which you could easily mistake it for an editorial in one of these prestigious newspapers, it suggests that the company is trustworthy, that it's believable, that it has the imprimatur of this very prestigious news organization. Why is this occurring? Simply because newspapers are seeing declining revenue. So even though the editorial people who produce the content have very high journalistic standards, the marketing people on the advertising side who have created this content creation, most of these magazines and newspapers have done that, then the company produces the content and it shows up under the byline of the New York Times or the Washington Post. It sends a message that what the tobacco industry doing is acceptable. Now, I will say that if the publishers of these prestigious newspapers and their editorial side really understood what was happening, they would bring an end to it, right? It's not worth the increased revenue. They have plenty of other companies using this methodology, but the tobacco company is unique. It is the leading cause of preventable death in America. And there's plenty of good reason for these newspapers and these magazines, which stopped taking tobacco promotion years ago, to realize that it's incongruent what they're permitting in their pages today.
And then, Sean, it really feels like on both sides of this debate, there are kind of deeply entrenched camps, people who it feels like no matter what the evidence suggests, they will believe what they believe. And you know, I wondered if this risks turning into a kind of quote unquote culture war, and if so, what that means for the ability of science to debate, to the ability of science to inform public policy around this topic.
Sure. Yes, it absolutely does. Anytime a topic becomes about identity, that's the risk. Identity and lifestyle have emerged as the primary marketing messaging tools in the late 20th century, and they've really been amplified on social media, as Rob alluded to. We can't underestimate the power of this marketing. We saw during COVID, for instance, when people held on to their denial that they were even sick with COVID up until the point of dying. In fact, people tend to double down on mis and disinformation and how ardently they hold on to it when they're faced with negative experiences about that. So it's extraordinarily powerful, and it's very dangerous to allow it to go there Of course, that's where the industry wants it to go because then they can control it. And we have to recognize that public health right now is in a political climate where we're somewhat fighting an uphill battle because public health is about the common good. And a lot of political messaging and identity and lifestyle messaging have been about the individual good. And when you pit those two together and you start talking about individual freedom versus the common good, all of a sudden you're right back at the very first PR campaign for American Tobacco Company in 1925, where suffragists and debutantes, as they were called back then, walked down Fifth Avenue during the May Day parade, proudly smoking cigarettes and calling them torches of freedom. And this was a PR company effort that was designed to break down the idea that women shouldn't smoke. And it was very, very successful and has led to the deaths of arguably millions of women since then, co-opting a political movement. So we see that same kind of thing happening today with messaging around freedom and individual freedom versus the public good. The good news is that the public still trusts evidence and science despite everything that all of these industries have thrown at it. They regard this as the fairest basis for public policy decisions. So what we have to do as people who are talking about these topics and messaging about science is really focus on exposing the science, opening it up to people so that they can form their own decisions about and their own conclusions about what the evidence shows. So to the extent that we can really lay the evidence out there rather than spoon feeding conclusions to people, we'll have more successful marketing or more successful outcomes responding to these marketing efforts by industry.
Well, I just wanted to comment about the regulatory challenges that are unique to the United States. It's very difficult to constrain advertising because it's been considered corporate speech is a part of the freedom of speech. So there are things that can be done in advertising, but because it's difficult, it's why it's so important, for example, to work on products. So you can say we're going to remove menthol from cigarettes, hopefully from all nicotine products that are recreational, not therapeutic, and it's well justified. And that the FDA has the authority to do. They can regulate nicotine, which of course is central to all of this, both in its concentration, as is done in Europe and otherwise. The only limit on nicotine in America is the bitterness of nicotine. And the industry, especially begun by Juul, has engineered around that through nicotine salts, right? So in the end of the day, it's all about regulating the product, but there's one important area of transparency we haven't discussed. And that is the pre-market tobacco applications are often thousands of pages long of industry-sponsored research, many of which never see the light of day. And I would argue that the FDA should make public the entire application file, with rare exception of those things that may deal very narrowly with sensitive intellectual property. Having seen some of these PMTAs, I will tell you that they're filled with biased research, which if was open to the light of day of critical scientists around the world, they would punch holes in it and it would assist the FDA in its evaluation of it to be able to do those critiques. Now the FDA is closed on the PMTAs, and that's really inappropriate because they're not getting the benefit of the wide scientific community that could assist them in their job of critically reviewing these applications for incidences of bias or intentional deception.
I think we have a process that can be redefined. There's nothing that prevents them from doing so, according to the Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act. There's a lot of leeway in that act that allows FDA to exercise this process that is more to make it more transparent, have more public accountability, but it has to take a step in doing so. From a public health perspective, we have to think more broadly about our multi-level approaches in the absence of the things that we know will work best and have broad population-based impact, but we have to start thinking beyond that because we don't want to have this conversation again 5 years from now.
We will, though. I mean, I hate to be cynical, but there is an asymmetry of resources between those of us in public health and those of us who might do counter advertising, for example, in the industry. The industry is the best people that money can buy, and they have enormous budgets. That's why I think it's so important we talk in terms of the products and not talk in terms of banning or prohibiting, talk in terms of market removal, or not importantly with the PMTA process, for example, not allowing mint or menthol or other flavors in the emerging product categories. And I think that's where the battle can be fought most successfully. Not that we shouldn't continue with our public messaging and education, that's critical. But I think the industry has shown over a century, it always adapts to any regulation, any attempt to constrain it, and it morphs into something else that lets them do what they're doing before. So we have to do opposition research as we carefully word any regulation. And in the end of the day, the cleanest way to do it, the most likely effective, is simply not permit emerging products that are wrong for the market to be on the market, if they're youth appealing particularly. Because the way eventually to reduce smoking in the adult population is to keep kids from getting started in the first place.
So if there's anybody from the FDA watching, I guess they know what they need to do, which is to open up those PMTA applications, which from my point of view as a journalist seems like a great idea. But Sean, from your point of view, what advice would you give to people, to policymakers specifically working in this space who are wanting to make evidence-based decisions?
Well, first of all, I would echo that. And I think that policymakers themselves can have an influence when they speak to, for instance, FDA administrators. What are they afraid of? Transparency, peer review, and critical thinking are what science is all about. And they're also what democracy is all about. So wouldn't we want that in our public regulatory system? So I think the idea of opening that up is very important and is certainly in keeping with the mission of the FDA. More broadly, I think that when policymakers are faced with these industry campaigns, they can be sophisticated themselves in calling them out and talking about the efforts that are being spent in order to skew the debate. When you can give people ammunition and you fire back against this type of spending, generally there's a backlash and people begin to be skeptical. You know, we've all heard about conspiracy theories a lot in the news lately, and people believing in various conspiracy theories. And these are conspiracies that are actually happening, and they're just as compelling, sometimes even more compelling. And policymakers are in a unique position to expose some of those conspiracies and to fire back and to get their constituencies talking about that.
I can't emphasize how much the point being made, though, about local efforts. You know, in the 1980s, you could smoke on an airplane and in a restaurant and a bar, and a number of communities, especially on both coasts, began to enact limitations on where you could smoke, and that permeated, eventually became state and became nationwide. I think we're seeing this with regard to flavors, and that more and more municipalities and counties are limiting the sale of flavors in one way or another, particularly around e-cigarettes, but also in some cases cigarettes as well. And that I think that that should be encouraged, because the last moving part is the federal government. It is slow. The industry is very fast at adapting, very able to adapt, and adapts far more quickly than the very gradual wheels that grind forward in the FDA. As well-meaning and dedicated to their task, it's just too slow of a process to keep up with an industry that's fleet-footed and highly creative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree. I mean, changing the social norms and values from the ground up matter. That is exactly how we won the battle with getting smoke-free policies in the nation before the scientific evidence had evolved. I mean, industry knew that secondhand smoke was harmful. But in terms of public health researchers and that evidence evolving, the policies at the local levels came first and they emanated up. We have got to think about what's in our playbook. What are some new tools that we're going to add? Are we going to take some of those old tools and put them to work so that we can create healthier communities that are free from tobacco's interference, whether it be on the scientific end, whether it be on the practice end, because we want to make sure that at the end of the day, our communities are safe from this very harmful product. There is the 2006 Surgeon General's report said there's no safe level of exposure to secondhand smoke. There's no safe level of exposure to tobacco products, period.
We've obviously heard from Robert, Pebbles, and Sean about what the FDA and what policymakers need to do. Barbara, I'll throw this question to you. What about people who aren't in those categories? What should they take from the discussion today, and how can they get involved in this issue?
Yeah, well, at Truth, we're collaborating with other leaders to protect legitimate tobacco control scientific circles from the conflicted interference of the tobacco industry. So we've led a tobacco scientific integrity group that brings together academics, tobacco control practitioners, advocates, and others that are working in tobacco control. And so we have an effort underway, and if people want to find out more about that, I would certainly invite them to contact me or to visit our website at the Truth Initiative to learn more. A couple of areas specifically that we're focusing on as a group is how we can pass and enforce strong conflict of interest policies with our journals where they're lacking. And like I talked about earlier with our conferences and other outlets, and as well really talk about the challenge that Pebbles outlined, which is how we educate the field, particularly new researchers, about the industry's past and present abuses and deceits and the consequences of industry involvement. And so, those are a couple of concrete ways that, a group is working together, and we invite others to join and learn more about efforts. Truth will continue to do research that exposes what the industry is up to around tobacco industry interference in our scientific spaces. All of this, of course, is critical, as discussed throughout the series today, the panel. At the end of the day, it took us decades to hold the industry accountable at the way that we were able to by the 1990s. And that took intensive, comprehensive collaborative efforts. And so the industry may have many more resources, but our effort, our group, we've got the tenacity and the will to stay in this and continue to make sure that the makers of the world's deadliest products aren't distracting us from a united science-based effort to improve public health.
Barbara, Pebbles, Rob, and Sean, thank you very much for your time today and for all that great insight on this issue.
Thank you. Bye now.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Again, thanks to our panel. And Robin, back to you.
Thank you, Ben, for leading this discussion today and for your important work in uncovering the truth about the tobacco industry. I also want to thank our panelists, Barbara Shillow, Robert Jackler, Sean Otto, and Pebbles Fagan, for sharing their valuable insights and expertise on this critical topic and the absolute need for transparency in the regulatory process, given the massive amount of industry-sponsored research being used in pre-market applications. And finally, thanks to all of you who joined us today. We hope these perspectives and information have been helpful to you and will inspire you to help thwart the tobacco industry's image rebrand, or charm offensive, as I call it. I call upon all of us working to end the influence of the industry and the harms of their products to continue to educate and encourage our colleagues and all reputable organizations, especially those that shape public opinion and popular culture, not to provide a platform for industry spin and borrowed credibility at the expense of public health. To learn more about this issue and get involved, please also visit truthinitiative.org. And thank you again for joining us.